We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww. Hit it! Sega's next-generation gaming platform. Revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay. All.
Hi, I'm Sir Topham Hakurai, and I have been a retro game collector for about 12 years now. I've been interested in retro video game systems and software since about the year 2008, having my youth been kind of brought up on, my later part of my youth kind of brought up on old episodes of The Angry Video Game Nerd. And how I got into retro collecting was, so James Rolfe, years and years ago, released a video about his NES collection. And I remember being so jealous about it that I decided right then and there to collect systems. And I am now the proud owner of a shit ton of systems. Mostly I have all the Nintendo systems that were released in North America, from the NES all the way to the Switch. I own most Sega hardware. I'm just missing the Dreamcast and the Game Gear. But handhelds are neither here and there, are they? I own Atari 2600, 5200. Going back to the Sega stuff, I do own all the add-ons for the Genesis. And then ColecoVision. As far as handheld systems, I own a Game Boy Color, multiple Game Boy Advances, Nintendo DS Lite, DSi, 3DS, and that wraps just about all of them up. So, I've been collecting for years, and this video is largely going to be about how I feel about one particular system in my collection, the Sega Saturn. How I got my hands on a Sega Saturn was actually quite a funny story. I had a friend who was the cousin of my old math teacher from a special needs program I used to go to. And that person would go up and buy old storage units and try and flip and resell whatever's inside of it. And one day, my friend took me to this guy's place and show me that he had bought a storage unit full of old video game systems. And I agreed that I would test and clean everything that was within that collection and give him a report of what works, what doesn't, and what, you know, could be resold. And as payment, I was allowed ownership of one particular system within that batch, that being a Model 1 Sega Saturn. It was also an early run Sega Saturn because its date of manufacture, I think either on the back side of the system or the bottom of the system, I forget which, said it had a manufacture date of May of 1995. So I obtained the system, and I realized very quickly that I was fucked. Now, the reason I say that I'm fucked is not because of anything awful or bad. It's just, I already knew that collecting for the Saturn was going to be a bitch and a half. I knew this because I know all the best games for it are super expensive. I knew at the time that a lot of the games are rare. A lot of the games, there's not a lot of games. And because, you know, a lot of the cheaper games are all the shitty ones nobody wants, whether they're sports games or hidden gems that nobody really gives a shit about. I don't know. I knew that the Saturn was going to be trouble, and I bought it, and I didn't even have any games for it. I had one working controller with it, and I largely used it as a novelty CD player up until I got my first few games. Daytona USA, Bug, DEFCON 5, and Shining the Holy Ark. Those were like my first 4 games that I got for the Saturn. And it was financially painful, especially Shining the Holy Ark. I got it as a disc, and I had to get a replica case for it, and yeah, it was fun. And that's how I came to possession of a Sega Saturn. So the rest of this video is going to be sort of a history detailing the Saturn, and then we'll be going into my opinions of the Saturn, and some of it will be unhinged rambling and ranting. I don't have a script, but I do have notes, but it's mostly just a general outlier of how each section of this video will play out. I guess we should move on. The history of the Sega Saturn goes back to about the early 90s, like 91, 92. And Sega, and you know, every video game company, after they release their next console, they're always working on the next generation hardware. And Sega wanted to make a console that would be uber successful in their home market. You see, Sega has never always been successful in their own home market. Like, yeah, they'll be successful in some market, but there's always some sort of weird market, like Brazil or Europe, and not really so much in the two big money makers that is Japan and the United States. And while they did get a guy named Tom Kalinske who made the Sega Genesis sell like crack in the ghetto, basically, during the late 80s, early to mid 90s, however, at the same time, Sega of Japan kind of got jealous because, one, they were never really competitive. Like, Sega always felt content not to rock the boat. They were not boat rockers by any stretch of the imagination, unlike their competitors at NEC, which were boat rockers, and they rock the boat, and they managed to rock Nintendo shit. They managed to punch a dent into the Famicom in like 1987, and it was proof that, yeah, you can topple a giant like Nintendo, but Sega, even though they knew they could, just didn't want to. They were content being in second place, and after the PC Engine was released, they were content to be in third place. However, due to Tom Kalinske pretty much rocking their shit by making the Genesis successful in the North American markets, they knew they had to have a taste of that success. So they designed a console that they knew would be uber successful in Japan. It would have a CD drive and would primarily do 2D graphics with some 3D special effects. Sadly, however, due to the changing of the times, 3D was beginning to be more popular. Thanks to Sega's own efforts with Virtua Fighter and previously Virtua Racing, there were people at Sega who knew that 3D was the future, but Sega knew that they could just always stick to 2D because back then, 3D, they thought that 3D was going to be a fad. Yeah, 3D's nice and all, but 2D is what got us before, and it will get us through the future. However, it didn't take them until the unveiling of the Sony PlayStation that they realized they fucked up. And so they quickly added a bunch of processors to it to try and make it do 3D, and it would do 3D. Just, it would require learning how to code 3 or 4 different CPU processors in parallel in assembly code, and thus they maybe accidentally on purpose, made the Saturn hard to program for. It also didn't help that the development units were a bit obtuse in the beginning. So in mid-1994 at the Tokyo Toy Show, Sega unveiled the Sega Saturn, and it was a pretty decent chunk of hardware. It had multiple Hitachi SH2 processors, and it could do some pretty impressive shit. And the Japanese public loved it. And so by the holiday season of 1994, the Saturn was released. And so was the Sony PlayStation. And the Saturn sold like gangbusters. Mostly because it had a lot of games the Japanese public really liked, like Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter was super popular in Japan, and so the Saturn sold very well. However, one of Sega's worst aspects about itself, and what Sega's worst enemy was not Nintendo, nor was it Sony, it was themselves, and their bad management led to them, essentially bad management decisions led them to prematurely release the Saturn in May of 1995 at E3. So what had happened was Sega didn't tell the retailers this. They were planning for September 1995 release, and they fucked it up. Numerous retailers pulled out. I think it was like KB Toys and maybe Walmart, I think. And the Saturn flopped right out of the gate. It was too expensive. In fact, the most famous thing that happened at E3 was that Sega did their show first, and they announced that the Saturn will be sold for $399, $400. Okay, not bad. Then Sony did their show, and their head of marketing, Steve Race, went up and said $299, $300. Damn! Sega just had its ass handed to it, and in America, the Saturn kind of just flounced about, and a lot of the Saturn's early games were hampered a lot by rushed games made by developers who couldn't understand how to really make games for it. And it also didn't help that, again, Sega's hardware, their development hardware and their software was bonkers to work with. That and the documentation for developing games was poor. It was poorly translated, it was poorly thought out, poorly written, and they had to try and make games for it. And that led to some games like SimCity 2000 and Gen War, at least according to Pandemonium. Love you, buddy. And they just didn't cut the mustard, I guess. And then when the Sony PlayStation came out, it was over. And a lot of the top brass at Sega of America wanted to dump the Saturn. And they've always wanted to dump the Saturn, even during the Tom Kalinske days, where he tried to work with Silicon Graphics to make a new console. Sega said no. He tried to team up with Sony to release the Sega PlayStation. Sega said no. And so the Saturn kind of just limped along in existence with an apathetic management that didn't want to put all their eggs in the Saturn basket. And they tried. They tried to make a Sonic game for it, and it ended up in development hell, and it didn't pan out. They tried with the Saturn, but they did the bare minimum to support the Saturn, and by summer of 1997, it was discontinued. Of course, in Japan, it was a completely different story. It sold like holy hell in Japan, and because of that, it managed to get supported right up until like the year 2000. By the year 2000, though, due to the failure of the Saturn, in which Sega lost $300 million and had to lay off a third of its staff, the writing was already on the wall for the Dreamcast, and Sega was on the rocks. Even back then, before the demise of the Dreamcast, it was on the rocks. And yeah, this is not a very good history of the Saturn. It's mostly just an overview of what happened. And I understand this is probably not the greatest retelling of the Saturn's history, but hey, I don't know. Anyway, let's get to the part where I rant like a madman about the Saturn. Why I do not like the Saturn. I mean, okay, so that's a bit of an over-exaggeration. I love the Saturn. I love this big black console of arcade goodness. But there's a reason why it's always at the bottom of my top best consoles. It's at the bottom of my top 10 best. It's at the bottom of my top 3. It's at the bottom of my top 5. And it's also at the top. It's also at the bottom of all my worst console lists, because I love this thing, but I also hate it intensely. And the reason is not because of any fault of the system itself. In a vacuum, the Saturn is awesome. In a vacuum, it's awesome. It's got a bunch of great games for it. It's lovely, it's quirky, it's weird, and it's full of Sega 90s goodness. It's just collecting for it is a bitch. Like, take the prices for the games example. Everybody's like, oh, get Saturn Bomberman, it's a hidden gem. Yeah, hidden gem, my ass. It's $500 fucking dollars. Oh, why don't you get, Panzer Dragoon Saga? It's the best game on the Saturn. I am not spending $1,500 on a 4-disc RPG that only lasts for like 4 hours. Like, for fuck's sake, like, I don't know. This thing only has 3 discs and it lasts like, what, 20-something hours? Only it's more like 50, but who's counting? Like, Jesus Christ, Sega. Like, I know a lot of these discs were rare because nobody bought them. Some of them had short print runs like Panzer Dragoon Saga. But then the entire community, most of which are 40 and 50-year-old men who, took advantage of the Saturn when it came out. And even more, they took advantage of the Saturn when all the games were in the discount bins. I knew a guy who got Shining Force 3, one of the holy grails for the Saturn, for pennies on the dollar because it was in a discount bin. And me, I had to start collecting in the year 2020, in like the winter of 2020.
And I had to suffer for it. And everybody's recommending like, oh, why don't you get, a Trarian Odyssey or like Albert Odyssey or whatever. Like, why are you fuckers recommending me games that I can't afford? Here's the thing. I live on Social Security. I receive disability checks. 75% of it goes to this group home. And I live in a special needs group home, and there's bills involved with that, where I have to surrender 75% of my SSI. That leaves $217 for me to spend. And I can't spend it all on fucking Saturn games, alright? Over on that board over there, and I'm going to include a picture over this, is a whiteboard I use for my budget. Usually about $60 goes into gaming. $50 goes into savings, $50 goes into food, subscriptions $6, unless it's my soy subscription for Nintendo for their shitty deluxe expansion pack, whatever, subscription service, which is this month. And the rest goes into my leftover balance. I have about $60 to spend per month across multiple different systems. Sometimes I have to prioritize. Sometimes I want to get stuff for my Switch. Sometimes I want to get shit for my PS2. But the Saturn, most of the games on the Saturn, I would essentially blow my entire SSI on. And I have shit to do. Like, eat food and like eat takeout food and, get shit off of Amazon. Especially since I have to replace, video cables and shit. So collecting for the Saturn is a bitch and a half because it's expensive. Like, yeah, collecting for it is easy peasy lemon squeezy, I guess. I mean, all you have to do is go on eBay or LukeyGames.com or wherever you go, click a few buttons, put in your credit card information, and bada bing, bada boom, you got a Saturn game. It's not always easy, isn't it? Especially for us poor folk, okay? I am fucking bumming. I'm a fucking bum. And I receive government checks. But I can't all spend it all on one place on the fucking Saturn. And you know what? The games are fine. So long you stick to the cheap ones like Daytona USA. I got Daytona USA complete in its original case for like, what, $15? At least not as bad as, Sonic Jam, where I fucking bounce like over $200 on. Yeah, for a disc that has a huge gouge in it and doesn't work properly, and for a replica case that didn't even have a real manual in it. Jesus fucking Christ. And of course, I managed, the only steal I got on a expensive Saturn game was Quake. And that's because I managed to get the price docked by like $20 because of a cracked case. Well, it was more like $10, but I mean, if we're talking about magnitudes of hundreds of dollars, what's $10 to $20 like, So that wouldn't be, the half of it. But then you have to get the special hardware for it. Like, for example, memory cartridges. Yes, the Saturn has a cartridge slot because fuck you, Sega engineers are doing weird shit with their consoles. I bet they made a sex robot using leftover parts when they were making the Sega CD. I don't give a shit. But like, memory cartridges. Why would you need a memory cartridge? Doesn't the Saturn have internal memory? Yes, except it's powered by a fucking watch battery. Like, who the fuck powers their system with a watch battery? There's a CR2032 in this system keeping my saves alive and well. That and the Saturn has limited save capacity. Oh my god. So you have to invest in a memory cartridge. You have to. Mostly because the Saturn can barely hold anything. And even if it could hold everything, the watch battery goes dead in 2 years. In fact, in the Sega Saturn manual, it says to regularly replace the watch battery that's inside the system. But no, because it's cheaper to get import games and it's cheaper to burn and pirate discs. Oh, I'm sorry, Saturn Dave. I can't use the P word on your fancy Discord server. But But then you need a Saturn Pro Kai cartridge, you know, so you can play your burned discs and your Japanese imports. Because the Japanese imports are, you know, super, you know, awesome because they're cheaper. You have to wait a month and a half for it to come across the Pacific Ocean. And hope to God it's still in one piece. And then, yeah, except the only problem with Japanese imports, you can't even read the language. Like, yeah, you can probably take a few Duolingo lessons, like, I guess I better go on Duolingo and learn to read Japanese so I can play, you know, one of those fancy schmancy RPGs. But you need this to play your imports in the first place. Personally, I got this thing mostly because I wanted to play the English patch of Lunar the Silver Star on original hardware, because as much as we all say, as much as those PC gaming master racists want you to believe that emulation is the greatest thing since Jesus Christ, or, you know, when Gabe Newell penned his book, Mein Kampf, you know, emulation is the greatest because everything's better on PC. Yeah, you and your $30,000 fucking rig, frick you. Maybe you should go to sensitivity training, you PC gaming master racists. But anyway, this thing is your ticket to greatness on the Saturn, because you can play burned games, which means you can save money on Saturn games. But then if you talk about it too much, then you get kicked off of a Discord server, and they just treat you like the weird kid on the short bus. Trust me, I was the weird kid on the short bus. Don't tempt me. But oh no! Your disk drive may fail. What are you gonna do? Oh, spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars on an ODE. What's an ODE, you may ask? Oh, it's only an optical disk drive emulator, so you can store games on an SD card, not have to use the CD drive. Oh wow! Great! Now I have to do surgery on my Saturn because all the disk drives are running on borrowed time? What a great system! Man, I'm so glad I got my Saturn for free. I'm so glad. Can't you tell I'm glad with my exaggerated arm motions and my voice being loud and me, putting on my happy eyebrows? See, these are happy eyebrows. Bloody hell, Sega. Why did you make a console that only sold 8 million units, and then every soy boy from across the universe that's into retro gaming want to own a Saturn? There's only 2 whole copies of Saturn Bomberman in existence? Yeah, $200. Yeah, $200 for the cream of the crop of ODEs. The Satiator. The Satiator is awesome. But knowing that I only have $217 per month to screw around, that's a lot of money that I'm going to be throwing around, meaning I would have to spend the rest of the $17 on food and whatever shit I want to do, and my internet subscriptions. Yeah, of course I can save money. I'm not a dumbass. But, I love the Sega Saturn. I just hate being a collector for it. And I hate how everybody on YouTube, all the old-ass retro collectors from, who have been here since, the day of the dinosaurs, get to, flounce about and recommend people games that cost anywhere from $70 to $1,000. Yeah. I bet when I get enough money to get Panzer Dragoon Saga, it better be worth every fucking cent. When I buy Panzer Dragoon Saga, I want it to be delivered to me, not in a FedEx van, to be shoved into a mailbox. I want there to be a silver Bentley or a big silver Rolls Royce to come up, and a butler comes out of it, and he gives my copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga on a red velvet pillow And on that red velvet pillow is a silver plate with the little dome things, the handle on top. And he says, "Sir, your video game." Yeah. Expensive ass Saturn games. Like, yeah, I'm ranting, rather, I'm ranting rather, like a madman. I said throughout this video that I rant like a madman, and I am a madman, see? I am a fucking madman. But that's because I'm a retro collector that operates on a tiny ass budget. Now if we go over here, this thing that's out of frame, partially out of frame, this is a PlayStation 2. It's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and it's actually affordable if you're on a budget. If you're a retro gamer on a budget, get this thing, not this. Me, owning a Saturn on a limited budget is like a person that harms himself because of bad mental health. And I mean physically harm themselves. This is the equivalent of slitting your wrists. Financially, of course. Financially slitting your wrists. But I love it. I love the games. The games are super fun. It's fun, to think of, the mystique of the Saturn. The console that failed. It's the system that Sega didn't give a fucking chance in North America. It got all the chances it could in Japan. And now we Westerners, us round-eyed, dumbass Westerners who eat hamburgers and pizza and drink Coca-Cola and watch football, the one where they tackle each other and wear the helmets that don't prevent them from having concussions. That kind of Westerners. We're fucked because of this thing. But I love it. The games are fun. I love the story for it. I love its tragedy. I love everything for it. I love you, man, but you're tough. You're a tough thing to handle. I mean, of course, I talk about this thing like how Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog's version of Dr. Robotnik talks about Sonic. Yeah, the Long John Baldry one. The one who's like, "I hate that hedgehog. He made me tear every hair from my beautiful head. I hate that console. I hate it. Scratch, grounder, make me a console that can sell at least 8 million more units. Snooping is as usual, I see." I think we should have a discussion on how we could, if we had a time machine, how could we fix the Saturn? I think we should talk about that next. So, how can we fix the Saturn? First, we're going to be using the same argument that online users talk about the Third Reich and how it could have won the Second World War. We're going to be using the same exact logic here. So, if you want to be pedantic, never mind the pedantic shit. Let's just get right in. First things first, we fix the hardware from a conceptual level. The hardware we can fix by making it a lot less complicated. Like, yes, we could probably keep the multiprocessor setup, because then it would have more power than the PlayStation 1. This gray spaceship. And yeah, we can make it a more powerful system. Yes, it should do 2D, but not to the extent it could do, because as much as 2D is great and all, and how we live in an era where it doesn't matter if a game's 2D or 3D or not, in the 90s, it was go big or go home. You either innovate or just go home and play your crappy 8-bit games. So, the Saturn, from the outset, should do 3D. Yes, it should stay quadrilateral. Yes, it should just do it better. And while we're talking about hardware, let's talk about development hardware. The Saturn should have had better div kits from the beginning. Also, better development software, and the documentation should have been better prepared. Like, yeah, you're translating from Japanese to English. There's gonna be some bad shit on the way. But you could have at least made it, so that way developers can easily know, oh, let me take this 2-week course somewhere in California. I'm going to read these manuals, and I'm going to use this development hardware thingy-mabobby, and I'm going to make a Saturn game. It should be as easy as that. But no, you have to get a big fucking box. You had to plug a Hitachi SH-2, emulator, and you're going to fit the socket in the CPU socket because you need one. And be careful, don't bend the pins, otherwise you're going to have to pay $500 for a new CPU emulator. And then, at least have the software be easy to use so you can do 3D games and make enough of these development units so that way developers can make games quicker and sooner. Like, for example, this game right here, it didn't have a development unit to make the game on until halfway through development. And this game suffered for it. This is a slow mess of a game. But it's actually really fun. And if you can get past the slow speed of the game, it's fun. It's a great port of a PC game. And then, while we're on the subject of games that suffered because of development units being goofy off, Gen War. Gen War was a 3D game, and they could barely do 3D on it. Like, the game's graphics suffered because of it. But I mean, it's still a fun game. It's just, had they had better development units and better documentation, this could have went from a decent game to a great game. Even better than that, a system seller. This could have pushed units, folks. This could have pushed units. And then we go and fix the marketing. Okay, the marketing for the Saturn was really weird, but it was also avant-garde. Here's the thing about avant-garde advertising. You should only do avant-garde advertising if everybody knows what the product is. You have to be clear and concise on what your product is. It shouldn't be weird or funky when you're struggling to push units like you would with the Saturn. You shouldn't. You have to be clear, concise, but you also should be competitive and aggressive. In the world of marketing, be aggressive. Be aggressive. Be aggressive. Be aggressive. And, I'm just going to check my notes real quick. Yeah. Also, another thing is that everybody talks about the Saturn lacking a marquee Sonic game. I mean, it got Sonic 3D Blast. By the time Sonic Jam came around, the Saturn was already donezo's. And even then, it was just a collection of the Genesis games, so why fucking bother, if I'm going to be real honest? Why bother? And then, outside of that, and then there's Sonic R, but Sonic R is a goofy odd game. Sonic R is a goofy odd game. So, here's this. Why not make an enhanced port of Sonic CD for the Sega Saturn as a launch game? Like, yeah, Sonic CD, it was the best-selling game on the Sega CD. But if you gave it a real 3D special stage, like you did with Sonic 3D Blast, and had it at launch, I felt like it could have changed something with the Saturn. Also, don't release the 32X. Don't release the 32X. What you do is you cancel some games, either downgrade them for the Genesis or make them Sega CD games, or you port them to the Saturn. Imagine having a port of Sonic CD and Knuckles Chaotix on the Saturn at launch. Like, yeah, they're 2D games, so they're not going to do very well. But hey, at least it's something Sonic related at launch. Imagine that. But of course, talking about, fixing the Saturn, its hardware, its development kits, its software, its marketing. Much like talking about, oh, how the Germans could have won World War II if only they had more oil, if only they made more Panzers 3s and 4s instead of Tigers and Panthers. But at the same, or maybe not invading Russia in the middle of fucking winter. But at the same time, the only way to like really change the parameter to make it so the outcome is better in that regard is to completely change history. Like with the Saturn, you could change everything about it, but it's not going to fix the root cause. The root cause is Sega's bad management. Sega's bad management all over the place was just god-awful. They were willing to sabotage the efforts of their American branch just because they could sell a system better than they did in Japan. And so they got their revenge, all right. They released the Saturn, super successful in Japan, not so much everywhere else. Not even in Brazil, where Tectoy was the giant over there. Even Brazil couldn't salvage the Saturn. Not even Brazil. That's fucking sad. I mean, to make the Germans win the Second World War, you essentially have to change the regime, and you have to change so much about it, but then again, it's not the same. They were going to lose, they were just going to lose anyway, and Sega was going to lose anyway as well. Sega lost big on the Saturn, and they suffered for it. To this day, Sega is still financially struggling. The only things they make are shitty Sonic 3D Sonic games, shitty, they make Yakuza games, which are pretty good, but yeah. And then they write off the coattails of Atlas. Anytime they make a new Persona game or Shin Megami Tensei, there's Sega, always riding off of Atlas's coattails. And the best thing Sega did was, fucking making Sonic movies. They turned Sonic into a film. And it was the greatest film series of all time as far as video game characters are concerned, because video game movies are kind of shitty. But hey, at least they made a successful product that had Sonic's face on it, that wasn't made by Christian Whitehead. Oh my god. But I think, now that we've talked about the Saturn, what makes me want to blow up my brains and do a fucking Kurt Cobain cover using a shotgun, and why, how we could fix the Saturn, but even if we did fix the Saturn, it's gonna fail anyway. It's that bad of a product. I think we should have some closings. I think we should step outside, take a deep breath, and maybe have a few closing statements. I really do love the Saturn. I think everything I love about it, I love the console design. I love how it's big and chunky looking. It looks like it could eat a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64 if it could. I love the way the top of the disc lid is kind of a bulge and has a fake window with the fake window slit in the center side. I love the look of the Saturn logo. I love the Sega Saturn font. I love how the games were all awesome arcade ports. I love how, there's a lot of very fun games for the Saturn, and I love the feel of the controller. I love fucking with the cartridges. I love the community for it. I love the community for the Sega Saturn, and as much as I, kind of mentioned Saturn Dave's name a few times, I like him too. He's awesome. Everybody I love at, the Sega Saturn Shiro podcast, I love them all. And I love how the community is taking advantage of the Saturn's hardware. Have you seen CubeCat? The Saturn finally gets a 3D platformer to call its own.
It's amazing. But the Saturn is frustrating to collect for. It is a frustrating piece of shit to collect for. And as a fan of video games, I love the Saturn. There's a Sega Saturn has a Sega Saturn shaped hole in my heart that, frankly, nothing can really fill it in. Not even with heart surgery and hamburgers, I can't, fill it in with. But as a collector, the Saturn just frustrates me. As a collector on a low, stupidly low budget, it just makes me mad. At the same time, thinking about it and playing it makes me glad. Like, I have, despite my limited funds and my limited, patience as an autistic adult, I love the Saturn. I think it's a swell console. Had Sega given it the chance it deserved, had the Saturn lived a full life, I feel like Sega could have been in a better position today than it was right now in this universe. And I bet there is a universe out there where the Saturn succeeded. And because the Saturn succeeded, they spent more time to refine the Dreamcast. And they gave it the ability to play DVDs. And they gave it much more graphical oomph and power and better computational power. And maybe if the Saturn succeeded, we would have gotten a 3D Sonic game from the 90s that we all could call our own. Had the Saturn succeeded, we probably got some good RPGs on it. Like, yeah, they use 2D graphics and nobody likes 2D graphics, but hey, an RPG's an RPG, am I right, folks? Man, had the management been better, had the Saturn wasn't so expensive to produce and wasn't so complicated to make games for, I feel like Saturn could have had a chance for success. And yeah, nothing's gonna stop the might of the PlayStation 1. Nothing's ever gonna stop that. But mild success is better than a severe failure. And between a bad victory and a slight victory, oh shit, I said victory twice. Oops. By a major picking either a major defeat or a slight victory, I'd pick the slight victory. I mean, back during my Picklehall gaming days, and yeah, Picklehall gaming was cringe, I'll admit that, but as an adult with autism who tries to be self-aware of the content he makes, I always end up making cringe in the end, and I'm sorry for making cringe, but yeah. Even then, the Saturn was kind of a mixed bag, and I even made a buyer's guide because Metal Jesus Rocks is a fucking grifter, because he tried to recommend people to buy these multi-$100 games. I mean, I wish I had the money to afford those, but I mean, I'm not rich. But I'm also not destitute. And I think I should bless my stars for that too, but I love the Saturn. I love Sega. Like, the only reason I'm such a Nintendo dork is largely out of necessity. I only like Nintendo and the Nintendo Switch out of necessity because Sega doesn't make consoles anymore. Like, yeah, PlayStation's fine. I never fuck with an Xbox, but PlayStation 5s are hard to come by, and the PlayStation 4 is dead. Maybe that's why I'm such a huge fan of the PlayStation 2. Like, it's a console that had every victory handed to it. It had its life handed to it in a silver platter. It was successful. 155 million units successful. And because of that, collecting for it is a breeze. $80. For $80, I could get... Recently, I spent $80 on 2 games. Suikoden 3 and Xenosaga Episode 1. But even though I spent $80 on only 2 games, at least they're games that, you know, I can feel satisfied from. Like, spending $80 on a Saturn game that's only gonna last me 15 minutes, man. Like, I mean, that's the harsh truth of having your console only be good for arcade games is arcade experiences are short. And maybe that's sort of analogous to how the Saturn's life is short. The Saturn, I feel like, is the greatest tragedy in gaming history. It's sad to see such a big, powerful, mighty console just fucking sink itself. It's like the Yamato battleship. A battleship that had every promise attached to it, only just to fuck about from harbor to harbor until it eventually got shot down and sunk. Yeah, there's a lot of history analogies in this video, and I'm a history nut. I love history. Maybe this is a story to learn from. A story about hubris and having faith in yourself. And had Sega had faith in itself and its products, maybe Sega would still be making consoles. I'm Sir Topham Hackrai, and thank you for watching.